I had just set my paper plate down on the picnic table when my son-in-law leaned over, twirling his fancy German car key like it was some kind of medal of honor. He didn't wait for anyone to quiet down. He smirked loud enough for the kids and cousins to hear and said, "Nice car, Pops. Didn't know they still made those rust buckets." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel from all of them, but it cut me all the same. I felt it in the pit of my stomach like a sudden cold wind across a warm day. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, nodded at him, and reached for a slice of pie as if nothing had landed. But I heard it. Everyone did. The old sedan sat out front, paint faded to a kind of dull gray, its hood speckled with years of rain and salt. The Camry had carried me through late shifts, funerals, and Sunday drives. That car knew me better than some of my family did. I kept it running, oil changed, belts replaced, and when the engine hummed, it reminded me of a time when things were simple, when I measured worth by how many years a man kept something alive, not by how shiny it looked parked in the driveway. I've been on this earth 71 years. I worked steel when steel was still king, came home with grease under my nails and a thermos that smelled of black coffee. The Camry was never meant to impress. It was meant to serve, and it did. But my son-in-law, with his hair slicked back, his watch heavy on his wrist, wanted to make a show. His words were more than a joke. They were a measurement, a way of placing me on a lower rung of a ladder he thought he owned. The backyard smelled of charcoal and corn on the cob. Children chased each other across the grass, their sneakers leaving dark lines in the earth. My daughter tried to smooth things over with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. She busied herself with the potato salad, avoiding looking at me. That hurt worse than his words. She knew better. She knew what I'd given the years I'd poured into keeping her safe, housed, and fed. And now she had a husband who thought he could shrink me with a single smirk. "Guess some men don't care what they drive," he added, sliding into his seat at the head of the table, as if he had earned the right. His new SUV sat gleaming at the curb, black paint, shining like it had just rolled out of a showroom. He tapped the key fob on the wood, waiting for me to answer. I didn't. I let silence grow around us until the younger kids, confused and restless, started whispering. Silence can cut sharper than words, and I watched his smile stiffen just enough for me to catch it. I cut my slice of pie cherry filling bleeding onto the plate and chewed slowly. I remembered the first time I'd driven that Camry home. My late wife sat in the passenger seat laughing because the radio only caught 2 stations. She didn't care. We had a roof, 2 daughters in the back seat, and the future ahead. That memory still rode with me every time I turned the key. He didn't know that. He couldn't. To him, it was just rust. Later, as twilight came, lanterns strung across the yard began to glow. The air cooled and voices grew softer with the evening. But that remark stayed sharp in my chest. My son-in-law thought he had settled something, thought he had put me in my place with a joke wrapped in wealth. He didn't see the way my hands curled beneath the table, steady but tight, or how I watched him pour himself a second bourbon like he owned the night. Pride can blind a man. I know because once it blinded me too. When the kids were sent inside to wash up, I caught his eye. He raised his glass in a mock toast. "Here's to upgrading soon, Pops." A few chuckled again, but this time it was thinner, weaker. My daughter's face turned pale. She shot him a look, one he ignored. That was the moment I knew the evening had crossed into something else. It wasn't just a family dinner anymore. It was a line being drawn quiet but clear between the old ways I carried and the shallow shine he thought was power. I didn't speak then. Sometimes silence is heavier than thunder. But inside, something shifted. I had no intention of fighting him with words that night. No, that would come later when the world was less prepared. For now I let the tension hang, let the air tighten, let him believe he had won with a smirk and a keychain. He didn't know what sat waiting in a locked garage across town beneath a tarp I hadn't pulled back in years. He didn't know what still ran like a dream, under polished chrome, waiting for the right moment to return. He thought he was laughing at a man with nothing left to prove. He had no idea what I still carried. And when he finally saw it, the night would belong to me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The air in the yard still felt heavy after his last toast, like smoke that refused to clear. I drove home that night with the windows down, letting the warm air of late summer brush against my face. The Camry's headlights threw pale beams across the road, and the hum of the old engine filled the silence. It was steady, faithful, the kind of sound a man comes to trust. But behind the wheel my hands were tighter than usual. Every curve in the asphalt pulled up his smirk, his glass raised in mockery, the glint of his keys. I carried that look with me all the way to my driveway. I parked in my usual spot beneath the oak tree. Its roots had cracked the pavement years ago, but I never bothered to fix it. That house was bought in '79, 2 stories of siding faded by time, shutters' crooked porch swing creaking in the wind. It was my kingdom, though smaller than most men cared to notice, and I had built it nail by nail when money was thin and backs were stronger. My wife used to sit on that swing with her coffee waving at neighbors. I could almost see her there as I stepped out carrying the pie dish back into a kitchen that smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil. I washed the plate in the sink, hot water steaming over my hands. That was when the anger found its place. Not wild or loud, but settled like a log placed carefully on a fire. My son-in-law had crossed something more than manners. He had pressed down on the years of work, of struggle, of quiet sacrifices that had kept this family standing. I thought of my daughter that night, how her eyes darted away when he spoke, how she tried to shield me from embarrassment and failed. That broke me more than his joke. She knew my worth, but she let his words hang in the air because she feared the storm he might bring down on her later. I walked into the den and sat in the old recliner that bore the weight of my years. On the wall hung pictures, some framed cheap, some still with the backs bent from moving them too many times. One was of me and my work helmet steel dust smeared across my cheek. Another of my wife with the girls at Christmas tinsel glittering in their hair. A lifetime lined up in crooked frames. That was the truth of me. Not the sedan parked outside, not the rust or the fading paint. I had carried steel, carried grief, carried joy, and built a world from it. It wasn't pride I felt, but something deeper, the urge of a man who refuses to be dismissed in his own story. I thought back to when I first met the man who now called me Pops, with a smirk. He had walked into my house wearing a suit that probably cost more than my month's wages at the time. He shook my hand with the grip of someone who thought deals were games. I saw the way he looked at my living room, at the sagging couch, the stack of bills tucked under the phone. He didn't say anything then, but I knew the thought was already there that his world was bigger, richer, cleaner. My daughter loved him, and so I swallowed it the way fathers often do. But that night in the backyard, he let it slip. He showed me what he had been carrying all along. And maybe that was the blessing hidden in the sting, because now I knew what kind of man I was truly facing. I leaned back in the recliner, eyes tracing the ceiling fan spinning slowly above. The house creaked like old bones settling, and I felt the weight of years in my chest. Yet underneath, something stirred. Not bitterness, not envy, a kind of clarity. I had kept a secret long enough, one tucked away in a locked garage I rarely visited. I told myself I was saving it for a time when it might matter again, though I never thought that day would come. That night, I knew it had. Morning came with the sound of birds clawing at the feeder on the porch. I brewed my coffee in the dented percolator, poured it black into the mug that still bore the logo of a company that had folded 20 years back. I sipped slow, watching the light spread across the yard, and I felt calm. The plan wasn't born in anger. It was born in truth. Some men need to be reminded that appearances are only paint on the surface, and that real worth doesn't shine until it's tested. I drove the Camry downtown, same as always. Folks at the diner nodded when I walked in. Old friends' faces lined with the same years as mine waved me over. We talked about the ball game, about the price of gas, about nothing that mattered much. But my mind was elsewhere, circling the thought of what sat under that tarp patient, as an old dog waiting for its master's call. By late afternoon, I pulled up to a garage on the edge of town. The building looked plain windows, dusty weeds curling through cracks. My name was still stenciled faintly on the door, though time had almost erased it. I unlocked the padlock, pushed the door wide, and let the scent of oil and leather drift out. The tarp loomed in the center, covering the shape that had slept too long. My hand lingered on the edge of the canvas heart, steady but strong. I pulled it back just enough to see the chrome catch the light. That was the moment I knew everything was about to change. The chrome gleamed in the dim light of the garage, catching just enough of the sun through the dusty window to make my chest tighten. I let the tarp fall back into place, covering the machine like a secret not yet ready to speak. I stood there a long time, breathing in the smell of fuel and leather, hearing echoes of my wife's laughter from the days when we rode together on long country roads. That car had been waiting for me. Now I thought it was waiting for him too, though not in the way he would expect. As I locked the garage again, the memories spilled over. My son-in-law had a way of making his victories small but constant, like gnats that never quit buzzing. He never swung hard enough to look cruel, but always enough to draw blood you couldn't show. At Thanksgiving, he'd slide the turkey platter closer to himself, cracking jokes about how my hands shook when carving. At Christmas, he'd hand out gifts wrapped in glossy paper designer names on the tags, while mine came in simple boxes from the hardware store. My grandchildren would rip into his first dazzled-by toys with flashing lights, leaving mine in a corner until later. He would smile satisfied, as if the point had been proven. And then there were the quiet ways, the ones that cut deepest. He never let me pay when we went out to dinner, but not out of kindness. He made a show of handing the waiter his black card, glancing at me to make sure I noticed. My daughter would place her hand over mine, gentle but apologetic, as if she too had learned to accept his way of measuring men. I remember one Sunday when I drove over to help fix their fence. I brought my tools, old but clean, every piece cared for through years of labor. He watched me unload them and laughed under his breath, saying, "They don't even make parts for those anymore, Pops. You sure they'll hold up?" I kept quiet, hammered the boards, replaced the posts, and when the job was done, the fence stood straight and strong. But that night when I sat at their table, he told my daughter to call someone professional next time. My work was standing right outside proof of my skill, yet he erased it with a single sentence. Exploitation doesn't always wear a mask of violence. Sometimes it comes in the form of constant dismissal, the way a man can strip you down piece by piece until even your family doubts what you're worth. I saw it in my daughter's eyes more than once. She loved me, but she had learned to flinch when I spoke too firmly, as if waiting for him to roll his eyes. The children began to copy him, too, teasing me about the Camry, about the way my clothes smelled faintly of motor oil. Kids don't invent cruelty. They repeat what they hear. One afternoon, weeks before that backyard dinner, I had taken my grandson to the hardware store. He asked if we could park far from the entrance. Why, I said, confused. He kicked the seat cheeks red and whispered, "Dad says people laugh at this car." I didn't scold him. He was only repeating what had been planted in him. I parked close to the door anyway, lifted him onto my shoulders and carried him inside. But the sting remained hidden like a bruise beneath my shirt. These were the small hurts, the ones that piled up like dust in corners until the air itself grew heavy. A man can take a few. He can laugh, swallow, keep his head down. But years of it settle on your bones. They make you question if your silence is dignity or defeat. That night in the glow of the lanterns at my daughter's table, when he lifted his glass and mocked me, it was not the first wound. It was simply the one that split the skin deep enough to bleed. I unlocked the garage again 2 days later. This time I pulled the tarp off completely. The machine underneath stood like a monument. A '67 Mustang fastback candy apple red polished chrome wheels that still shone like mirrors, leather seats soft as they were the day I bought them. I had kept it hidden a secret project through years of overtime and scrimping. My wife called it foolish, once then laughed and said it made me happy. I never sold it. I never let it rot. I kept it alive, waiting for a time when it might matter. I walked around it slowly, running my hand along the hood, feeling the cold metal wake something in me. I thought of him then, the way he waved his key like a trophy. He thought wealth was the only currency a man could spend. But real worth isn't bought new every year. It's built and kept alive. The engine roared when I turned the key. It was a sound that shook the walls deep and raw, the kind that turns heads even blocks away. I sat there gripping the wheel, heart racing, knowing exactly what had to be done, because the next family gathering wasn't far off. And this time I wouldn't be pulling up in the Camry. The Mustang's roar lingered in my ears for days after that first ignition like thunder that never quite rolled away. I kept her under wraps, hidden from the world, but just knowing she was alive again made me walk straighter. Each morning when I pulled the Camry from the driveway, I carried the secret in my chest like a loaded chamber. The old sedan hummed its steady tune, but behind the wheel I could already feel the growl of the fastback waiting for its turn. The next family gathering came sooner than I expected. My daughter called on a Wednesday voice, tight but forced into cheer. "We're doing Sunday dinner. Everyone's coming. Can you bring pie?" I said yes, though. Her tone told me more than her words. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons likely pushed by him. He wanted another show, another round at my expense. I spent the week quiet, moving through my routines. But inside the fire grew. Every time I remembered my grandson's shame in the Camry, every time I thought of my daughter's eyes darting away to keep peace, I felt the weight of years pressing down. Sunday dinner wasn't just dinner anymore. It was a stage. And this time I wasn't walking on unarmed. When I pulled into their street that afternoon, I didn't take the Camry. The Mustang rolled forward like a beast waking from a long sleep engine, snarling low candy apple paint, throwing back the sunlight so bright it hurt to look. Neighbors turned their heads. A boy on a bike slowed to a stop, jaw open. Even before I cut the ignition, I felt the silence spill across the yard. My son-in-law stood on the porch, drink in hand, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't smirk. He blinked hard eyes, narrowing his hand, frozen around his glass. I stepped out, slow pie dish in hand, like nothing had changed. The screen door creaked as my daughter came rushing out. "Dad." She breathed, her voice split between shock and something else, something like relief. Her husband set his drink down, straightened his shirt, and muttered, "Well, look at that." But his voice cracked faintly on the last word. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute. My nephews and nieces crowded the windows, whispering about the car, darting glances at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. My grandson pulled at my sleeve, eyes wide, whispering, "Grandpa's that yours?" I nodded, ruffled his hair, and saw in his face the pride that had been missing for too long. That was worth more than any shine of chrome, but the table was a battlefield, and he wasn't about to surrender without fight. He raised his glass again, louder this time, pushing bravado into his voice. "Well, I guess even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while." Pops must have stumbled onto a collector's dream. The words dripped with sarcasm, but the edge of doubt betrayed him. He was rattled, and everyone could hear it. My daughter shot him a look sharp enough to cut. She hadn't planned this, hadn't expected it, but the weight shifted. I could feel her siding quietly with me, though her lips stayed pressed tight. Around the table, others began to prod. My brother-in-law leaned back in his chair, chuckling low. "That's no stumble. That's care. That's years of keeping something alive. Not everyone can do that." His wife added, "You know, not everything worth having comes with a dealer warranty." Each remark was like another match tossed onto the fire. My son-in-law's jaw flexed as he tried to laugh it off. He poured himself another bourbon, the bottle clinking harder than it needed to. "Sure, it's nice," he said, eyes darting to me. "But anyone can buy shiny if they throw enough time into it." That was when my nephew, barely 20, spoke up. "Not true. My buddy's dad tried restoring a car like that. Gave up. Said it was too much work, too much patience. Most people don't last a year with it. This is different." His words landed like a hammer. The younger ones were no longer looking at the man with the black card. They were looking at me. I felt it then, the shift in the room, the balance tipping. For years I had been the quiet presence, the man with grease on his shirt and a tired smile. But that night they saw me as something else. A man who had built, who had kept, who had endured. And he, for all his wealth and polish, was suddenly smaller. Dinner carried on, but it was brittle. Every compliment about the car, every whispered question about its engine or history dug at him like salt in a wound. He tried to change the subject, talking about his firm, his deals, the trips he was planning. But the children's eyes glazed over the adults, nodded politely, and then the talk turned back to the Mustang. He ate quickly, jaw tight, drinking more than he needed. I caught my daughter's glance, soft and trembling. There was something in it that hurt me, even as it warmed me. Gratitude, yes, but also shame for having let his sneers cut me for so long. I reached across, patted her hand, and gave her a smile that said it was all right. As the plates were cleared and the night deepened, he finally snapped. "It's just a car," he barked louder than he meant to. The room stilled. Forks clinked against plates, and the children froze. He realized his voice had cracked too much, his mask slipping in front of everyone. His cheeks flushed red, and for the first time I saw fear tucked behind his arrogance. That was the moment I knew this wasn't only about a car. It was about every inch of respect he had stolen, every slight he had hidden in a laugh. The war had started long before, but tonight he had shown his weakness. And I was just getting started. The words hung in the air like a slap. It's just a car. His voice still echoed as the silence swallowed the room. My daughter pressed her lips together so tight they nearly vanished. My grandson stared at him, then at me, confused by the sudden fracture in the evening. I sat still, fork in hand, staring at the meatloaf cooling on my plate, and felt something inside me bend. Not break, not yet, but bend so sharply it made my chest ache. Because it was never just a car. It was never just steel and paint and rubber. That Mustang carried my life inside it. Long nights when I was barely more than a kid, saving pennies from each paycheck, skipping new boots so I could stash a few dollars more toward the down payment. The day I drove it off the lot, my wife slid across the bench seat, her hand small in mine, her laughter spilling out the open windows. We carved our lives into the miles together. That car took us to hospitals for births, to funerals for parents, to motels when we had nothing but each other. When she got sick, I would drive her into the city for appointments. She would rest her head against the glass and say the rumble of the engine soothed her, reminded her that she was safe. The last day she rode in it, the leaves were falling red and gold. She looked at me, smiled weakly, and said, "Don't you ever let this one go." I never did. Every bolt I polished, every belt I replaced was a promise I kept to her. So when he laughed, when he called it just a car, he wasn't mocking the machine. He was mocking all of that, every mile, every sacrifice, every memory that stitched together the story of my life. The weight of it nearly buckled me right there at the table. My throat closed. My hands shook under the tablecloth, and for a moment I thought I might stand and walk out, leave him to his hollow victory. But then my grandson whispered barely loud enough for me to hear, "Grandpa, it's beautiful." Those words steadied me like a hand on my back. I saw my wife in his eyes, the same flicker of loyalty, the same gentle spark. And suddenly the hurt turned sharp, clean like a blade forged for battle. I set my fork down and looked at him. Really looked at him. His shirt pressed perfect, his watch gleaming, his bourbon glass sweating on the table. He thought the house was his. The table was his. Even the air belonged to him. But that night, for the first time, he looked small. Maybe he felt it too because he snapped. "What you think this makes you better? You think some old junk you kept in a garage means anything?" The room went rigid. My brother-in-law cleared his throat, ready to speak, but I raised a hand. "You don't know what that car means," I said, my voice low, steady. "You don't know what it carried, what it cost, what it kept alive." He laughed, brittle. "It's just metal, Pops. Stop acting like it's holy." And that was when something in me cracked wide open. Not anger, not pride. Grief, raw and hot, years of it spilling out. "I drove your wife home from the hospital in that car the day she was born," I said. My daughter's eyes filled instantly, her hand flying to her mouth. I drove her to her first day of school. I drove her away from prom when her heart was broken. I drove her to the church the day she wore her wedding dress. Every milestone she ever had, that car was there. And you call it just metal. He shifted in his chair, color draining from his face, but I wasn't finished. The words had been buried too long. And when her mother was dying, that car was the last place she laughed. The last place she looked at me and told me to hold on. So don't you dare tell me it's just a car. Don't you dare. The table shook with the weight of it. My daughter sobbed quietly, tears streaking down her face. My grandson looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, eyes wide with awe and sorrow. My son-in-law sat back, lips tight, searching for something to say, but nothing came. His silence told the truth, louder than his words ever could. For a long moment, nobody moved. The house creaked, a chair leg scraped, but the air was thick with something heavier than sound. I felt hollow, emptied out, like I had ripped open a vein and poured myself across the table. But beneath that collapse was a steady current, an iron thread that held me upright. I had spoken what needed speaking. He broke the silence at last, muttering, "You think stories make you stronger. This is the real world, Pops. Nobody cares about your memories." But his voice trembled, and that was enough. Everyone heard it. I pushed my chair back, slow and deliberate, and stood. The wood groaned beneath me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I looked down at him and said, "You'll care. Soon." And with that, I turned and walked out to the driveway, the cool night air rushing in like a flood. The Mustang waited chrome, catching the porch light. I pulled the tarp from the back seat, folded it careful, and tossed it into the trunk. Then I opened the driver's door, slid behind the wheel, and turned the ignition. The roar shattered the quiet, shaking the windows. Inside, I saw faces at the glass, pale and wide-eyed. My son-in-law's shadow lingered behind them, frozen. I pressed the gas, the engine snarling like thunder. The war had moved outside. The Mustang's engine thundered through the quiet street until the whole block seemed to vibrate with it. I held the wheel's steady headlights casting long beams across the pavement, while inside my chest something shifted. For years I had carried silence like a shield, letting his smirks and cheap victories cut me while I kept my head bowed. But in that moment, with the machine alive under my hands, I felt a rise inside me I hadn't felt since I was a much younger man. It wasn't rage anymore. It was resolve, sharp and clear like the edge of a new blade. I drove aimlessly, at first, down back roads, lined with oaks, past quiet houses with their porch lights glowing. The night air rushed through the open window, cooling my face, carrying away the tremble that had shaken me at the table. I let the miles settle me, let the rhythm of the engine drum strength back into my bones. My wife's memory lingered beside me, not as a wound, but as a companion. I could almost hear her voice saying, "Stand tall. Don't let him take more than he already has." By the time I pulled into my driveway, the plan had already started to form, though I couldn't have written it down if I tried. It wasn't about humiliating him with horsepower or gleaming chrome. It was about reclaiming the ground he had stolen inch by inch. My worth didn't need proving, but it did need showing, if only so my daughter and grandchildren could remember what was true, before his sneers buried it. I sat in the recliner until dawn, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't rest. I thought of the way my daughter wept at the table, of how her shame and gratitude mixed together until it nearly broke me. I thought of my grandson whispering that the car was beautiful. And I thought of the years I had swallowed the fence he said wasn't good enough, the gifts tossed aside, the dinners where I was made into a punchline. Each memory stacked like bricks, and on them I began building something new. The next days passed quietly, but my silence was different now. Before it was the silence of a man beaten down. Now it was the silence of a man waiting, steadying, preparing. At the diner, the old boys leaned in closer when I mentioned the Mustang was running again. Their eyes lit, their voices carried, and I saw the spark it gave them too. Men like us, we weren't meant to fade quietly while the younger ones wrote us off. We carried too much history, too much work in our hands. On Thursday, my daughter called. Her voice was hushed. "Dad, I'm sorry for what he said." I closed my eyes, listening to the strain in her tone. She was torn, caught between love and loyalty, bound by a marriage that had grown heavy on her shoulders. "It's not your fault," I told her, voice firm. "But it won't happen again." There was silence on the line, and then a trembling breath. "What do you mean?" she asked. I didn't answer directly. "You'll see." That night, I pulled into the garage again, lights flicking on above the Mustang's gleam. I opened the trunk and laid out tools, polishing rags, bottles of wax I hadn't touched in years. My hands moved slow but sure, working the chrome until it shone like mirrors, conditioning the leather until it drank deep and softened. Every turn of the wrench, every sweep of the cloth was a kind of prayer, a promise that I would not let myself or my family live beneath his shadow any longer. As I worked, I remembered the way my wife used to sit cross-legged on the hood, teasing me about the grease on my jeans. I remembered my daughters piled in the back, singing along to the radio windows down their hair, whipping in the wind. Those memories didn't weaken me anymore. They hardened me. They reminded me that my life was built on something solid, something earned, something he could never touch with his smirks or his bank account. By Saturday, the Mustang wasn't just awake. It was alive, reborn, ready. I looked at it in the bright morning light and saw more than a car. I saw a weapon not for revenge but for truth, and I knew exactly where I'd aim it. That evening a message came through my daughter's voice again, though I could hear his presence behind it. "We're having friends over tomorrow. You should come." I could hear the edge in her words, the pressure he put on her. Another stage, another chance to put me down in front of others. Only this time the script would not go the way he imagined. I hung up the phone, stepped out onto the porch, and breathed deep of the cool night air. The cicadas buzzed, the stars stretched endless, and I felt the iron thread in me pull tight. Tomorrow wasn't just another dinner. It was the reckoning. And when I pulled into that street, it wouldn't be in silence. The roar was coming for him. Sunday afternoon burned bright, the kind of late summer heat that lays heavy on a man's shoulders. I turned the key and felt the Mustang shudder awake, that deep growl vibrating through the floorboards and into my chest. I eased her onto the road, candy apple paint flashing in the sun, and every eye that caught her lingered. I could feel the looks, the necks craning the way traffic bent around me. But it wasn't the strangers I was headed for. It was him. When I rolled into their cul-de-sac, children stopped mid-game and stared. A neighbor watering his lawn lowered the hose mouth open. The Mustang's engine echoed off the rows of houses, a sound that demanded notice. I saw my son-in-law's SUV gleaming in the driveway, polished to a shine that usually screamed superiority. But today it looked plain, like a store-bought suit next to a tailored masterpiece. He stood on the porch with a couple of his friends, drink already in hand, his voice carrying with the easy arrogance I'd come to know too well. When the Mustang roared into view, his words trailed off. He blinked once, twice, as if the sight couldn't be trusted. The glass tilted in his hand, spilling a line of amber down his knuckles. His friends turned, eyes wide, grins spreading. One of them let out a whistle. Good Lord, that's a machine. I killed the engine, the sudden silence, sharper than noise, and stepped out. My daughter was at the screen door, frozen halfway out her face, pale with shock. Behind her, my grandson darted forward, pushing past her to the steps. "Grandpa!" he shouted, voice breaking with excitement. He barreled toward the car, hands hovering reverently over the hood. "This is yours," I nodded once. The pride in his face hit me harder than the sun overhead. My son-in-law's laugh came late, forced, brittle. "Well, well." Pops decided to dig up a toy. His tone was meant to sound casual, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. His friends weren't buying it. One of them leaned close to the Mustang, shaking his head. "This isn't a toy. This is history. Do you have any idea what it takes to keep one of these alive?" The man shifted on his porch, his glass rattling as he set it down too quickly. "Anybody with money and time can get one," he muttered. I stepped forward, my boots heavy on the pavement. "Not anyone," I said, low but clear. The weight of the words carried, silencing the small crowd that had gathered at the edges of the yard. "Takes patience, care, work that doesn't quit when the shine fades." His friends nodded, murmuring agreement. One clapped me on the shoulder, respect in his eyes. My son-in-law tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. The balance was shifting right there on his front lawn, and he could feel it slipping out of his hands. Inside the table was already set glasses, lined roast in the oven. But the meal was secondary now. The real feast was out here, where every glance and whisper stacked weight against him. He tried to redirect, waving his friends toward the porch. "Come on in, let's eat," he said too loudly. But they lingered near the Mustang, circling, admiring their voices, spilling questions toward me instead of him. "Original engine. Did you restore it yourself? Where'd you keep it all these years?" Each answer I gave was simple, steady, but each one pulled more of the spotlight away from him. My daughter slipped down the steps, her hand brushing mine for just a second. I felt the tremor in her fingers, the quiet gratitude she didn't dare voice with him watching. His mask cracked further. He poured another drink, downed it fast, and barked, "All right, enough about cars. Let's eat." His voice carried that hard edge of panic, like a man clutching at rope that was already slipping. We moved inside, but the weight followed us. At the table, his friends leaned toward me, asking about the Mustang, about the steel mill, years about the stories that seemed to unfold with every sentence. My daughter's eyes glistened as she listened, as if hearing her father's life for the first time in years. My grandson leaned close, hanging on every word. Across from me, my son-in-law sat, rigid knuckles white around his glass. He interrupted when he could, trying to steer the talk back to himself, his deals, his travels, his polished life. But his words fell flat. Nobody wanted to hear about quarterly bonuses when the air still hummed with the echo of that engine. At one point, his hand slammed the table silverware, rattling. "Why is everyone so obsessed? It's just a damn car." His voice rose too loud, and the silence that followed was heavier than the outburst itself. His friends exchanged looks. My daughter flinched, and my grandson stared at him with something close to fear. I leaned back, slowly folding my hands, and let the quiet stretch until it burned. Then I said, calm and steady, "No, it's never just a car. It's what it carries." His face twisted red, creeping up his neck. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. The words lost. He reached for his drink, but the bottle was empty. He gripped the glass anyway, holding it like a weapon he couldn't use. The air in the room was thick, brittle, ready to snap. My daughter's eyes darted between us, tears pressing at the corners, her body taut as a bowstring. My grandson leaned against my arm, his small hand clutching my sleeve, waiting. That was when the front door creaked open again. A neighbor stepped in, sheepish but excited. "Sorry to intrude," he said, "but half the street's outside. Folks are saying they've never seen anything like that car." My son-in-law's face drained of color. The fight he thought was private had just spilled into the open wider than he could contain. And suddenly I knew the real reckoning had only just begun. The neighbor's words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Half the street outside. My son-in-law froze his glass trembling in his hand. He had built his world on appearances, on being the one others looked at with envy. Now the gaze had shifted, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down. His friends stood awkwardly glancing at one another, caught between politeness and fascination. My daughter's face flushed, not with shame this time, but with something sharper, as if the truth she had buried too long was clawing its way to the surface. He tried to laugh, a sound brittle and hollow. "People will gawk at anything shiny. Doesn't mean it matters." His eyes burned at me, desperate, pleading for me to slip, to give him back some ground. I didn't answer. I let silence build the same silence I had held at that first backyard dinner, but this time I didn't carry it as defeat. This silence belonged to me, and it was louder than his noise. One of his friends cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "I don't know, man. That car isn't just shiny, that's soul. You can't fake that. You can't swipe a card for that." Another nodded. "Takes years, decades. That's the kind of thing you pass down." Their words sliced him deeper than mine ever could. He slammed the glass down so hard it cracked liquid, spilling across the table. My grandson flinched. My daughter whispered, "Enough." But he wasn't done. His voice rose sharp and angry. "You all act like he's some saint. He drove steel and tinkered in garages. Big deal. I built a career. I put us in this house. I give her and the kids more than he ever could." He jabbed a finger at me, spittle gathering at the corners of his mouth. "He's just an old man clinging to rust. You can't live on stories." The room was taut as wire. I pushed my chair back slowly, my body heavy but steady. I stood and looked at him, meeting his wild eyes with calm. "You're right," I said, voice quiet but firm. "You can't live on stories. But you can't live without them either. Without them, you're nothing but numbers on paper. Stories are what make us human. And every mile of that car is a story you can't erase." My daughter stood too, tears streaking her face. "He's right," she whispered, her voice shaking but clear. "You've spent years cutting him down, cutting all of us down. It's never enough for you. Nothing is ever enough." My son-in-law turned on her, stunned, as if betrayal had landed from the last place he expected. "You're siding with him," he hissed. She didn't flinch this time. "I'm siding with the truth." The words cracked something open. The children, wide-eyed, clung to the edges of their seats. His friends exchanged looks, the kind men share when the veil has lifted, and they see a man for what he truly is. My brother-in-law, who had been quiet all evening, finally spoke. "You built a career, sure, but respect isn't bought with checks. Respect is earned day by day. He's earned it." My son-in-law's face twisted, cornered, desperate. He barked, "You all think you're better than me because of him, because of some car." His voice broke on the last word. I stepped closer, the room holding its breath. "No," I said softly. "Not because of the car. Because when everything else is stripped away, what you've built is paper. What I've built still stands." He staggered back, eyes darting sweat shining at his temples. He looked at my daughter, but her gaze didn't soften. He looked at the children. but they leaned toward me. He looked at his friends, but they had already turned their respect elsewhere. The empire he thought was untouchable crumbled in front of him, not with fire or fury, but with the quiet, undeniable shift of truth. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. He gripped the back of his chair, knuckles white, and whispered through clenched teeth, "Get out." But it wasn't me they were looking at anymore. It was him. My daughter's voice cut through steady this time, almost frightening in its calm. "No," she said. "You're the one who needs to leave." His eyes went wide, panic flaring, the mask finally torn. He stammered, "What did you say?" She didn't repeat herself. She didn't have to. The children clung to her. Her brother rose from his seat, and his friends stepped back, leaving him standing alone at the head of the table he thought he owned. His glass lay shattered bourbon soaking the cloth, the symbol of his power, nothing but a mess on the wood. I turned then, not towards the door, but toward the window where the crowd outside still lingered. Neighbors pressed close, curious, whispering. They had seen the car. Soon they would hear more. The story was already spreading, slipping beyond his control. And in that instant I realized this battle wasn't ending here. It was only about to spill into the open where everyone would see the truth laid bare. That night, after the shouting had died down and the guests had gone, I drove the Mustang home under a sky so black it looked like it could swallow everything. The road was empty, the headlights carving their thin path across the asphalt, and my thoughts were heavier than the engine's growl. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't even angry anymore. What I felt was something slower, deeper, like the quiet of a river carrying years of silt. I sat in the driveway for a long time before cutting the engine. The house loomed in its familiar silence porch swing, creaking in the warm night air. I closed my eyes and saw my wife there, coffee in hand, smiling at me the way she used to when I pulled in after a late shift. For years I thought silence was strength, that swallowing a man's cruelty was the cost of peace. But tonight I understood something different. Silence can be a shield, yes, but if you hold it too long, it becomes a chain. Family isn't about who holds the head of the table or whose keys shine brightest. It's about who shows up, who carries weight without needing applause, who leaves behind something that lasts. I had been carrying those lessons my whole life, though somewhere along the way, I stopped believing they mattered in the eyes of the younger generation. My son-in-law fed on that doubt, twisting it into power. But the truth is, power built on arrogance always cracks. It cannot stand when real weight leans against it. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water, sat in the recliner, and let the house settle around me. My daughter's face kept rising in my memory, wet with tears, but finally steady. She had found her voice tonight, not because I forced it from her, but because she saw me stand tall and remembered she could too. That gave me more comfort than any victory ever could. My grandson's whisper still echoed as well, Grandpa. It's beautiful words that carried more than admiration for a car. It was respect for a man he suddenly understood. That respect had been mine all along, but now it had a voice. As for my son-in-law, I don't know what will come of him. Men like that can either crumble or change. Pride has a way of cornering them into choices, and forgiveness only works when a man is willing to look in the mirror and see himself clearly. If he comes with humility, I'll receive it. Not for his sake, but for my daughter and those kids. Because forgiveness isn't about forgetting the wound. It's about refusing to let it poison the whole body. But forgiveness doesn't erase justice. He'll have to live with the truth, exposed with the weight of the respect he squandered. I leaned back, eyes on the ceiling fan spinning slow, and thought about the arc of my years. Steel mills that roared and died nights when bills stacked higher than my pay mornings, when I rose before the sun just to keep food on the table. None of it glamorous, none of it shiny, but all of it real. That's the kind of life that gives a man backbone. And it's the kind of life I want my grandchildren to see, to carry, to remember long after I'm gone. Not as a sermon, but as proof. Out in the garage, the Mustang rested chrome, cooling in the dark. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a reminder, a living thing stitched into my story. I thought of the miles I had yet to drive, maybe with my grandson beside me. Maybe with my daughter reclaiming pieces of herself she'd tucked away too long. There was justice in that, a quiet kind. Justice that didn't roar like an engine, but hummed steady like the Camry that had served me faithfully all these years. I stood and stepped out onto the porch. The cicadas were loud in the trees, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and warm earth. Across the street, a neighbor waved. For the first time in years, I waved back without lowering my head. My shoulders felt lighter. My chest felt strong. The war wasn't about cars or pride anymore. It was about reclaiming space in my own family, reminding them that dignity is not something you can mock away. I'll carry that lesson into every mile left to me. That self-respect isn't something given. It's something held through rust and polish, through silence and roar. That forgiveness doesn't mean bending. It means standing taller because you know what you're worth. And that justice, the kind that lingers, is not about crushing another man, but about showing him what truth looks like when it refuses to bend. The night stretched out endless above me. I breathed it deep, the kind of breath that clears a man's chest. Tomorrow would come with its burdens, but tonight I was steady. Tonight I was free. Thanks for listening to the story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment to let us know what you think.